Hello, this is lecture 19 of Introduction to the Sikhs, and I'm going to speak on Sikhs in contemporary America in a comparative perspective. I've added this lecture to the 18 that were recorded 2 years ago because so much has happened in the last 2 years that I wanted to provide some perspective on recent events. And I want to also set the stage for your final paper assignment. Now, if we think about what has happened in the last 2 years, obviously the most significant event has been the pandemic that has had a global impact. I think in the United States, I would identify two major events that are relevant in the context of what I want to address today. One is the murder of George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter movement that became salient as a response to that. And secondly, the insurrection at the Capitol in January 2021. And I will also talk about immigration policy. I think there's less to say there in terms of any dramatic change, but nevertheless, I think the fact that many Sikhs are immigrants is relevant. I will also talk about events in India because, again, many Sikhs have connections to their homeland of Punjab and events in India, in particular, a very major protest by Indian farmers, which was actually dominated in some sense by Sikh or Punjabi farmers, had a significant impact on the diaspora. But let's start with the pandemic. And I think, of course, in the United States, the pandemic, I think, just highlighted for us the inequalities of race and class that exist in the United States. And it also led to some events that I think really illustrate some of the underlying challenges that America faces. So we know that the pandemic affected certain minority communities more severely than others, and poor communities. And I think there were significant challenges for Sikhs living in rural communities in California, for example. Some of the impacts, differential impacts, were associated more with class and location rather than race or ethnicity. I think in the case of African Americans, of course, there was a significant impact because of mistrust due to past U.S. government actions with respect to certain types of so-called health experiments. In any case, there was some interesting responses in the Sikh community to the pandemic. One very heartwarming response that I saw was Sikhs basically taking the institution of langar out of the Gurdwara, the community kitchen, and setting up public food banks. And this was, I think, an example of Sikh tradition at its best. It's hard to say whether it made any significant impact at a national level, but one could see in certain communities that it was helping. And of course, if it's not maybe easy to remember, but at the beginning of the pandemic, during the lockdowns, there was really a very severe crisis in terms of food availability and hunger. And I think some of that still persists, though it's become less obvious. The other event that I want to, let me continue with the pandemic, and then I'll come to the murder of George Floyd. I think one very unfortunate aspect of the pandemic and disturbing aspect, let me say, was the targeting of Asians and Asian Americans because of the claim that somehow this virus had come from Asia, particularly China, and it fueled a lot of hate. I think Sikhs weren't directly the victims of that, but what has been nice to see is that Sikh civil rights organizations have been expressing solidarity with other Asian Americans. Recently there was the first anniversary of the attacks on Asian American women in Atlanta, and at least two of the major Sikh civil rights organizations put out statements of solidarity. So I think this is an important development from the perspective of the Sikh community, where they are starting to see themselves more and more as part of a wider coalition of people of color. I think where the Sikhs are now also has something to do with the murder of George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter movement, because I think for many Sikhs that again highlighted the shared problems of inequality of treatment in society. And of course, the murder of George Floyd was in some ways the most stark and disturbing aspect of that. So, but this is obviously something that has been present in American society for a long time. Debates are ongoing. One can see a lot of pushback and denial and so on. And again, I think Sikh civil rights organizations have recognized that this is part of a broader issue that impacts American society, just as they have been more openly acknowledging the fact that African American efforts to achieve civil rights starting in the 1950s and 60s have provided benefits to the Sikh community in the 21st century. So I think these events are, I think, just two examples of a kind of disequilibrium in American society, and the January 6th Capitol riot, in some sense, reflects that broader disequilibrium, where some people were willing to challenge the most basic democratic institutions of the United States to express their grievance. And I think one can see that the problem is not just one of a small number of disaffected people, but one can see that there's a lot of kind of I don't know how to put it, maybe denial or kind of qualified acceptance of this kind of approach in sections of the establishment. So I think that this is something that reflects the broader changes that American society is undergoing, where it is becoming more racially and ethnically diverse, and that is leading to changes in the structures of power. One can see some of this playing out, for example, in attempts to gerrymander congressional districts and attempts to change electoral laws to give politicians more control over voting and so on. So I think voting rights and battles over that are also a symptom of this general process that America is undergoing. I think one can also see the same impacts in how the 2020 census was conducted, because there were attempts, for example, to add a citizenship question, and that was designed, I think it wasn't made explicit, but it was implicitly designed to discourage counting of immigrants. With respect to immigration, I think there hasn't been much basic change. I think some aspects of immigration policy in in the years leading up to 2020 were especially problematic and disturbing. But in some sense, America has been struggling with immigration policy for decades, and I think Sikh voices have been part of the discussion, but I think they've not, in some sense, been significantly affected by immigration policy as compared to other groups. Now, I'll come back to contemporary America, but let me now turn to Sikhs in relationship to India. And India is undergoing its own upheavals. It's not undergoing demographic change in the way that the United States is, but there is a significant progression of ideology in India, where the ruling party there is much less friendly to minority identities, and is seeking a much more homogeneous version of what it means to be Indian. And one can see parallels to that in the emergence of national identities in the European context in the 19th century, and one can see similar developments or phenomena in other Asian countries as well. I think in India it's particularly disturbing because independent India was founded as a secular democracy, with secular meaning not separating religion from the government, but in some sense accepting all religions as having the same status in society. I think the developments in India pose certain challenges for Sikh identity, and some of those spill over into the U.S. setting. Some of the issues actually go back to the problems that Sikhs faced in the 1980s and 90s, where identity issues became part of a separatist movement, though I think the separatist movement itself was became mixed up with just broader and milder demands for greater regional autonomy. In any case, one finds in the U.S. Sikhs are still protesting the actions of the Indian government or the Punjab state government in the 80s and 90s, which led to killings of Sikhs, and the Indian government representatives in the U.S. are very sensitive to that. So one gets a lot of pushback. So, for example, Sikhs in California asked that their various city councils pass resolutions condemning genocide against Sikhs in 1984 during the pogroms against Sikhs at that time. And the representatives of the Indian government, the consul general, have tried to stop those resolutions. So it's interesting to see how what is happening among Sikhs in the United States and California in particular is still connected to what has happened to the Sikh community in their homeland of Punjab and India. Now, the recent event that really actually caught the world's attention was the farm protests in India, farmer protests in India. Those were motivated by the Indian government's attempt to reform agricultural marketing to actually open up agricultural markets to more competition, and their goal was to increase efficiency. On the other hand, many farmers were actually happy with that, but in the case of Punjabi farmers, who are mostly Sikhs, the major concern was that this was actually a step towards removing government support for the food grain procurement program, which provides, for example, support prices for the growing of wheat and rice, which go into the national food grain stocks, which are then used to provide subsidized or free rice and wheat to poor Indian citizens. So again, the bills were not directly aimed at changing this system, but farmers were, I think, perhaps rightly concerned that this would be the first of several dominoes to fall, and they were concerned that this would lead to a major upheaval in their ability to earn their livelihoods. So what one saw was farmers protesting. So the main protest came from farmers in Punjab and a couple of neighboring states, and they went to the borders of the national capital of Delhi and camped there, and this became quite a cause célèbre globally, because one saw this long-running peaceful protest. Again, it was interesting because there were a lot of aspects of Sikh tradition in terms of how the protesters were being served by the setting up of free kitchens and medical supplies and so on. A lot of that the financing of that came from Sikhs in the diaspora in Canada, the United Kingdom, and the United States. To cut a long story short, actually the government, surprisingly, unusually for the government, it withdrew the farm bills, and I think it is not. Unfortunately, it wasn't because of the fact that the farmers were that it acknowledged that the farmers were right. It was actually because many of the farmers came from a very populous and politically important state of Uttar Pradesh. These were not Sikh farmers, but the government wanted to make sure that it didn't lose political support in Uttar Pradesh. So in some sense, the Sikhs were not really did not represent the Sikh farmers did not represent the decisive factor in the government's U-turn. In any case, what this illustrated was, again, the very strong connections between Sikhs in the diaspora, including the United States and California, and Sikhs in India and Punjab in particular. There were demonstrations in the United States, in New York. In California, for example, there was a demonstration which involved a convoy of Sikhs going over the I think the Bay Bridge from the East Bay to San Francisco to protest at the Indian consulate. One can see many of the themes of the Sikhs as a global diaspora in this particular, and how this particular event played out. Now, returning to contemporary America in particular, I want to recall for you a couple of the videos that I drew your attention to in the very first introductory lecture. I think there's a couple of videos which spoke to Sikhs trying to project themselves as mainstream Americans. There were public service announcements where Sikhs were talking about, liking Star Wars or liking American sports and so on. And what one can see, and of course the implication was that even though many Sikhs look different from the say mainstream American, they are just as American in terms of their identity, and of course that approach has its limits, because it shouldn't be the case that one's rights and identity as a citizen are somehow necessarily tied to being accepting of or buying into mainstream culture. So I think one can step back and look at those kind of public service announcements, maybe with a somewhat critical eye, and recognize their limits. And I think we see those kinds of issues coming up in other contexts, not just having to do with racial or ethnic identity, but also issues of gender and sexuality and so on. So I think one can turn a somewhat critical eye to that approach. On the other hand, I think one can also be sympathetic to the desire to normalize the Sikhs as part of a part of America. It's a tricky issue, of course. So a couple of the other videos that I drew your attention to at the beginning of the quarter also, I think, have some relevance here. If you remember, one was from The Daily Show about Islamophobia, and Sikhs were talking about how they were being mistaken for Muslims, but also pointing out that was not something that meant that they were trying to, that they were in any way condoning Islamophobia. And so that is, I think, something that still is an issue. It's become, I think, somewhat less salient because there hasn't been any issue with that kind of problem. I mean, Islamophobia exists, but it hasn't. I think it hasn't flared up particularly in the last 2 years. In any case, I think that issue crops up with respect to what has been going on with Black Lives Matter and anti-Asian American hate crimes during the pandemic, because all of these are examples of underlying problems of accepting minorities, and particularly people of color, as equal members of American society. And what I see is more and more that younger Sikhs in the United States and California, second-generation Sikhs, have a very good understanding of these kind of issues at a general level. So it's not just about, it's no longer, I think for many Sikhs, it's not just about being recognized and accepted as Sikhs, but also, again, expressing solidarity with other minority communities, and in particular, people of color. Again, I think there are some class differences. I think, and it's not clear cut, because sometimes working class Sikhs will be in positions where they want to keep their heads down and be accepted say, let me just put it straightforwardly, into white society and white power structures. And similarly, at the level of elites, one has a similar desire to be part of that elite structure. But I think it's fair to say that once one gets out of those elite structures, one sees, I think, a greater consciousness of these issues of identity and recognition of the power structures in American society. So what's interesting in that sense is that I think the Sikh civil rights organizations have been pretty much started by middle class urban professional Sikhs, but I think they've broadened their understanding and scope of the position of Sikhs in American society. And I think with respect to immigration policy also, one is seeing these civil rights organizations taking a broader stance, because, again, I think while their primary goal is to advocate for Sikhs, I think they again recognize that a lot of these issues are not issues of Sikh rights, but of minority rights, and even more than that, human rights. So I think this discourse about human rights I think is something that Sikhs in the United States are participating in more fully. And I think just as in the case of other South Asian communities, one is seeing a broadening of choice of occupations by young Sikhs. It used to be that, again, the immigrant stereotype was that your child would become a doctor or an engineer, and I think more South Asians, for example, are going into the media or becoming lawyers, and often getting into public interest law and so on. So I think this is a welcome development, and hopefully, as you're also seeing, Sikhs getting into politics with, for example, a Sikh attorney general in New Jersey, and a Sikh mayor in one of the towns in New Jersey, and so on. And these are turban Sikhs, so they're very visibly identifiable as as what might have otherwise been considered to be the unacceptable other. Here also, let me comment on the position of Sikhs within the Asian Indian community, and I think there are still tensions here. I think political and ideological developments in India have also had an impact on the Asian Indian community. I think one is finding some more support for a particular version of Indian nationalism among Asian Indians. I'm using I think a census category. One can also use the term Indian Americans. In any case, I think some of the differences between Sikhs and other Indian Americans go back to events in India in the 80s and 90s, where Sikh immigrants don't feel any loyalty or any sympathy for the Indian government, because they feel that it hasn't that its human rights record with respect to Sikhs has been very poor. I think also there are issues of class as well, because a lot of the Indian American community represent a migration through the immigration category of high skill. A lot of that was fueled by the IT boom in the 90s and early 2000s. And so you have a lot of very well-educated, high-income professionals in the Indian American community, and that is quite well documented. Sikhs stand out because I think more Sikhs have come through the family preference in category of immigration, and many of them have come from rural areas of Punjab through family ties, and one sees considerable difference in their socioeconomic status. So I think these differences, even in the second generation, are reflected in their approaches to identity, and I think many Sikhs have wanted to be counted separately from other Indian Americans. And of course, the 2020 census was the first time that a category of Sikh was created. It wasn't, I think, one of the pre-specified categories, but there was an option of writing in Sikh for ethnic identity. And this was, again, an interesting phenomenon, because technically the U.S. Census doesn't count religious affiliations, but Sikhs were being treated as an ethnic category rather than as a religious category. And one has seen that in the United Kingdom in a different way, where Sikhs were treated as a different race, so that the Race Relations Act in the United Kingdom could be applied to them to stop certain kinds of discrimination. So there are many interesting issues here, of course, of categorization with respect to race and ethnic identity and so on, that I think are worth exploring. And as we've discussed in earlier lectures, these issues of identity have been part of debates about immigration and citizenship and rights and so on, and Sikhs have been part of those debates. And in some sense, where we are now is that the laws are much more supportive of equality, but actual practice isn't always in complete conformity with legal structures. And as I said, one is seeing some pushback in terms of how the laws are structured and applied in things like voting rights. So these are, I think, very major issues that face American society today. So we've had a change in administration in 2021, but these issues are equally salient and important and difficult now as they were in the previous 4 or 5 years and before that. So these issues are not going away. I'm sure there's more that can be said on all of this, but what I wanted to do is just offer these reflections prompted by events over the last couple of years. And what I'm asking you to do in your final paper is to write an analysis with some reflections on these issues in the context of Sikhs in contemporary America, but also in a comparative perspective with other minorities, both minorities who have been here for centuries, like African Americans, but also more recent immigrant minorities. And again, I think there are a lot of complexities. There are also, I think, a lot of issues that often don't get surfaced, or if they get surfaced, they get put in certain boxes as being too threatening. I think that what I hope is that this course ends with an opportunity for all of you to reflect on these wider issues in American society, and to write an analysis that will promote your own understanding and eventually that of others as well. Thank you for taking this class. It's really been very important for me to create this class, and I hope that it's offered many times in the future, and that it's something that is of value to all students throughout the University of California and maybe beyond. Thank you.